Good afternoon, everyone, as you're arriving to this SEEP webinar on choirs in the age of COVID-19. I know this has been a much anticipated webinar, so we're just waiting a few seconds as people file into this very tight Zoom room in which we're trying to remain at social distance. Before we begin, my name is Michael Sniffen. I'm the Dean of the Cathedral here on Long Island, a place where the Choral Foundation is a pillar of our liturgical ministry. And so this question has been very important to us. I've been looking forward to this webinar myself. I'm delighted to moderate it, and I'm very much looking forward to the responses of our great panelists. So to begin, we'll just go around the Zoom room and ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Welcome.
Hi, I'm Jamie Hittel. I'm Director of Music at Christ Church in Greenwich, Connecticut.
Maybe I'll go next. My name's Declan Costello. I am an ear, nose and throat surgeon from the UK.
I'm Jonathan Vaughan, and I have the honour of being Jamie's Associate Director of Music at Christ Church in Greenwich, Connecticut.
Hi, I'm Meg Harper, and I'm the Associate Director of Music and Organist at St. Michael and All Angels in Dallas.
And I'm Andrew Kryzak. I'm the Associate Rector of Christ Church Georgetown in Washington, D.C.
Thank you all so much for joining me for this webinar, and everyone will have an opportunity to speak. We're going to begin with Declan, who'll give about a 20-minute overview of the PERFORM study, and then some comments from the other panelists, and then plenty of time for questions from attendees. So over to you, Declan, and thanks so much.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Now, what I'm going to do now is to share my screen with you. This will not be death by PowerPoint, I promise you, but just a few slides by PowerPoint as reminders for me as much as anything. So if there's a problem as we go along, then please do electronically raise a hand and interrupt me. Thank you again very much for the invitation to join this webinar today. It's a great honor to be with you, and I know that there are friends and musical colleagues out listening, so hello to you wherever you are. Just a little bit about who I am, just for 30 seconds. I'm now an ear, nose and throat surgeon, an otolaryngologist, but I started by doing a music degree at St. John's College, Cambridge. I was a choral scholar there many decades ago now. Having finished the music degree, I then moved on to Imperial College in London to study medicine. So I did a total of 8 years as a student. My parents were thrilled, as you can imagine. I then moved to the Oxford region and did specialist training as an ear, nose and throat surgeon, an otorhinolaryngologist. And I've been a consultant ear, nose and throat surgeon from 2010 till the present. And given my background in singing, my specific interest within ENT is the T bit, the throat bit, and I specialize in voice disorders, and I continue to sing professionally. So why was singing shut down? Well, there were several high-profile events early on in the pandemic at which singers became unwell, and there were deaths in choir members and in some of their families. And it was unclear at that stage why there had been such a significant spread within those groups. A feeling came about that singing might somehow intrinsically be dangerous. So the very act of producing a note from your larynx might itself be a dangerous thing to do as compared to speaking or shouting or breathing. And this led very quickly to choirs being shut down, and also to wind and brass instruments being banned in a lot of places as well. And we ended up having to try and turn around that and actually try and explain to people that singing is not inherently so different, physiologically speaking, from shouting or speaking. It's just you're using your larynx in a slightly different way. And we needed to develop some science around why these outbreaks had happened. So I think one of the key things just to think about at the outset is what is the difference between an aerosol and a droplet? Aerosols and droplets are both produced from the mouth or produced from your instrument if you're an instrumentalist. And the aerosols are sufficiently small that they float in the air, and the only way they can be got rid of is to ventilate them away. And they're typically below the size of about 5 microns in size. A droplet, on the other hand, is a particle that comes out of your mouth and then falls onto the floor in front of you. And typically they'll fall onto the floor about a metre or two in front of your face. And it's that metre or two in which they fall, that's the basis of social distancing. And here in the UK, our government is advising us to distance by 2 metres if at all possible, or 1 metre if that's not possible. So that's a kind of bit about aerosols and droplets. And what we wanted to do with the Perform study was to look at the amount of aerosol that was being produced by singers and by wind and brass players, and compare that to speaking and shouting, because we wanted to know, is there really genuinely such a huge difference in the amount of aerosol being produced in singing versus speaking and shouting? So we assembled this team of ENT surgeons, laryngologists. We had chest doctors on board as well from the Royal Brompton Hospital. The aerosol scientists were clearly absolutely critical in this. Professor Jonathan Reed was their lead. He's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Aerosol Science and Technology, so very much at the top of his game. And we will be involving computational fluid dynamic modelers as well, and I can maybe talk a little bit about that later on. The overseeing body of this piece of research was Public Health England, and the funding came from the British government as well, from the Department of Digital Culture, Media and Sport. It's worth noting that there was no industry funding, so there's no vested interests. It's not like we were being paid by the promoters who really wanted to see a particular outcome. It was all very much looked at objectively. And the protocol design was very rigorous and went through a number of iterations with the input of DCMS in the UK government, and ethical approval was sought and approved. So there were various logistical considerations. It's worth bearing in mind that there was a very pressing, urgent need to do this work very rapidly, because there was no singing happening at all. We're now in sort of March, April, May, June time. And we had to get on with it very quickly. We needed to think about the equipment. We needed to think about recruitment of the participants in this study as well. And for our purposes, we used our personal contacts, and we also used the BBC singers, who are a professional choir, singers from the Royal Opera House, English National Opera, and a variety of pop, rock, and various other singers as well. So this is the research team in the lab, so to speak, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the nature of the lab in just a moment. But we came up with this rather contrived acronym jumbled up from all those words in there, and we came up with the acronym PERFORM. We gathered 25 professional performers, and you can see there the spread of different genres. It was very important that we weren't seen to be just focusing on one particular genre, so we got a lot of different styles of singing. And the singers, you'll see some photographs in a second, but the singers performed by singing into a 3D printed funnel, and out of the back of the funnel was a tube that was collecting the particulates that came out of the singers' mouths, and those particulates were being counted. This thing at the bottom is particularly important. We used a clean air environment, an orthopedic operating theatre that had absolutely zero background particulate at rest, so to speak. And that was really important, because a lot of the other studies up to that point have been done in rehearsal spaces or in concert venues, where actually there's quite a lot of particulate matter floating around in any event. So we wanted to use somewhere that was very quiet in terms of the background particulates, so that every single particle that was detected by the machine, you could be absolutely sure had come from that person's mouth. What did we measure? Well, we measured the number of particles coming out of the participants' mouths, and also the size of particles. And that's really important, because that gave us the total mass of particles that was there. And that's because if you only count the number of particles coming out of the mouths of the performers, you're only getting half the story. You actually need to measure the size of them, and then you can aggregate that to get the total volume, the total mass concentration. So that we're talking about the potential dose of SARS-CoV-2 released by an individual who might be carrying the virus. We adopted a standard operating procedure that every single performer did very rigorously. It was all extremely regimented. We got them to sing a sustained R in the middle of their range at a medium volume, then to sing a sustained R an octave above that. They spoke the words of happy birthday several times over at a low, medium and high volume. They then sang happy birthday at a low, medium and high volume. And you can see, look, with 25 participants, happy birthday. We were absolutely sick of it by the end of it. But there you go. These are the things we do for science. We then got them to breathe in and out through their nose and mouth quietly, and through their nose quietly alone. And then at the very end, we got them to repeat the sustained R so that we could be sure that at the beginning and the end, the two matched up. So we were getting some intra-participant consistency. And at the end, we did a cough, because coughing is supposedly very dangerous. Now, you might ask about the low, medium, and high volume thing. Was that just the subjective opinion of the participant? No, it wasn't. They had a decibel meter in front of them, and they were calibrating their singing volume according to the decibels, and we told them to sing at 60, 80, and 100 decibels. So this is the experimental setup. We've got the, along the right of that photograph, you can see the computers and the big white boxes, the machines that are counting the particles. You can see the singer is standing up to the funnel and singing into there, and it's the particles are being drawn through the machines and counted, and their sizes measured. And there's an awful lot of computation that went on after that, as you can imagine. So here are some of the results. Now, on the left, obviously, is just another picture of the experimental setup, but let's have a look at the image on the right. This shows along the x-axis, along the horizontal is time, and along the y-axis is the particle number concentration, in other words, the number of particles being produced by this particular person. And this is the whole experiment, so all of those different bits of singing and speaking and all the rest of it compressed into one graph. So each peak is a particular vocal activity. So at the beginning, you can see they have sung one note in their mid-range and then a higher octave several different times, several peaks. They speak happy birthday several different times, sing happy birthday in the green several times, and then breathe and repeat the first note. And the key thing, the thing that our aerosol science colleagues were particularly excited about was the fact that the count went right the way back to 0 every single time the person stopped phonating, stopped using their voice. And that was really good, because it meant that we could be absolutely sure that every single thing that was going into the particle counter was actually coming from the participant. So let's just talk a little bit about the results. There are two graphs here, and I'm going to explain exactly what they show. So the one on the top shows the particle number concentration, the number of particles being produced, and the one at the bottom shows the mass concentration. And I'm going to show you that actually, broadly speaking, they show very similar things. So the first thing to note is that there is a significant degree of intra-participant consistency. So have a look at the red circles here. The red circles are showing the R at the beginning of the experiment, the R at the end of the experiment, and those two things are matching up. So in other words, we know that the experimental setup is giving us valid results because it's the same at the beginning and the end. And by the way, this is an aggregate of all of the participants lumped together. And the boxes are the main participants, and the whiskers that you can see on those are these sort of outliers. The key thing that we found, and I think one of the main things that's been talked about, is the fact that there was a profound effect of volume. So what you can see here is that as the person speaks happy birthday at quiet, medium, and high volumes, and then sings happy birthday at quiet, medium, and high volumes, the amount of particulate being produced goes up very significantly. And bear in mind that if you look at the y-axis on this graph, it's a log scale. So these are sort of almost exponential increases. So there's a factor of 20 to 30 from the very quietest point to the very loudest point. Whether you're speaking or singing, you're producing 20 to 30 times as much particulate matter between quiet and loud. So that's a huge effect. Is there a difference then, and this is the key question, is there a difference between singing at loud or medium volumes and speaking at loud or medium volumes? Well, yes, there is. Now, there we go. And here now look at the blue circles. So the blue circles are ringing the high volume of singing on the right and the high volume of speaking on the left. And you can see that they look fairly similar. Actually, as it happens, there is more particulate matter being produced during singing than speaking at those high volumes. But the difference between those two activities, singing and speaking, pales into insignificance compared with the effect of volume. So between the quietest and the loudest, huge difference, but between singing and speaking, a kind of, yeah, there is a difference, but not nearly as big. And I hope that's reasonably clear. So that's for the number concentrations. The graph below shows mass concentrations, and actually you can see it shows pretty much broadly the same story. So I hope that's a reasonable explanation of where we've got to with those. We wanted to look at whether gender and genre made a difference to the amount of particulate produced, and the simple answer is that there is not. Whether you were singing in, whether you were male or female, opera, musical theatre, choral, or anything else, the amount of particulate produced was broadly the same. Now, on the basis of this, and as I say, we assembled this pretty quickly. On the basis of this, and we were doing the experiments at the beginning of July, the results we were kind of slowly drip feeding to the UK government because they were desperate to know what they could do. On the basis of this, in the middle of August, the UK government changed its rules. Having previously outlawed singing entirely, singing was permitted with distancing, but with normal social distancing, with 1 to 2 meters. And this was one of the performances just over the last few weeks. This is a choir called Aura, who are a British professional choir, and they're singing here in the Turbine Hall at one of the big art galleries in London. And this study, along with others, has allowed singing to open up again in the UK with social distancing and with all of the other strictures that are in place in terms of mingling of different groups. But it has meant that for professional and amateur groups, we're able to get back to singing. And one of the choirs I sing with, the Holst singers, have gone back to singing in recent days as well. So we need to think about how we can manage all this and how do we use this information. And I think we're now in an era, we all accept the fact that we're in an era where there is no such thing as eliminating risk anymore. You go to the shops, there is risk. You meet somebody in work, there is a risk. You go to a canteen or a restaurant, there's risk. But we can minimize and mitigate risk. And I'm going to talk just for a short few minutes about how we can think about mitigating those risks. Location, location, location is clearly very important. The size of the location is absolutely critical. Ventilation has been made a huge deal of in the last few weeks, and I'm sure we will talk a lot more about that in the coming months as well. Duration, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these points as we go along, but clearly the duration that you're singing is going to make a difference as well. The number of performers will make a huge difference, and the audience, the number of people in the audience can make a difference. And finally, we'll talk about the volume of singing as well, and whether amplification can be employed in those scenarios. So location, let's talk about that for a second. Well, the size of the room that you are in and that you're singing in is going to determine the dispersal of the aerosol and hence the concentration. A singing teacher colleague of mine very charmingly put it like this. She said, if you take a pea in the sea, your pea dissipates into a very large, pretty much infinite space. If you pee in a swimming pool, heaven forbid, then your pee is going to be very much more concentrated. And the same thing applies to the amount of aerosol that is dispersing within the space that you're in. If you're in a small, cramped community hall, then you've got a lot less space into which the stuff can disperse. If you're in a huge cathedral, or better still outdoors. Now, I have to say from the UK perspective, the British weather would really stop you from singing outdoors to any great extent. The acoustics when you're singing outdoors are not great. Instruments, clearly, when they get rained on, they don't like that. And there are issues of light. I'm speaking to you from Oxford. It's now 8:20 in the evening and it's pitch black outside. So you need to think about these things. But singing outside is clearly something that a lot of groups have been employing. Ventilation is something we are going to be talking about a lot over the course of the next few months and years, I suspect. Yeah, you can open all the windows and doors. It's pretty chilly here in Oxford now. So in winter, I think that's going to be increasingly difficult. Mechanical ventilation, there are going to be more and more very clever ways of ventilating spaces, I suspect. I've just put this diagram up on the right to highlight the fact that there was this particular incident in a Chinese restaurant in Guangzhou, and there was a demonstrable recirculating of the air-conditioned air, and all of the people up at that end of the restaurant, or a lot of people up at that end, contracted coronavirus from one infected individual. So if you are going to have mechanical ventilation, it must not recirculate. And as I say, the ventilation engineers are going to be thinking about this. Computational fluid dynamic modeling is the process of computers generating algorithms for how air flows in a particular space. Now, in order for the computers to do that, you need to have an idea of the size of the space, of how much aerosol is being produced, of air flows, where the doors are, and all the rest of it. But CFD modeling is going to be very useful, I suspect. It goes without saying that the shorter your rehearsal or your performance is, the less aerosol that's being produced. I mean, that's just common sense. The number of performers is clearly important as well. This is a group called the Marion Consort. There are only 5 or 6 of them on stage at any given time. If you compare that to the Huddersfield Choral Society, there's a problem there. And there's another problem that we may come on to later on, which is perhaps to do with age. Some amateur choruses have an older age group. Some of the professional choirs are smaller and also have younger singers as well, and hence perhaps less of a risk to those performers. Think about the audience for a moment. You know, an audience sitting quietly will generate aerosol. As you are sitting there right now, you are generating aerosol. And if you've got 200 people in an audience, they may be generating as much aerosol as 5 people who are singing on stage, for example. This is a very difficult one to control, particularly if you're in a rock or a pop concert. But audiences should be discouraged from singing, chanting, whooping, yelling. It's been very difficult, and I've seen a number of online concerts over the last few weeks, and the sheer enthusiasm and joy in the audiences who are wanting to show their appreciation is very difficult, and there has been a lot of whooping and shouting, so I don't know how you suppress that. Remember that the louder you vocalize, there is massively more aerosol. This is what we're trying to avoid. One of the slightly less helpful headlines that came from one of the UK papers was that performers could sing or play softly to reduce COVID risk, study shows. Well, actually, that's not what we showed. We showed that the louder you sing, the more aerosol that's produced. But what we were not saying is that you should just sing or play quietly, because that's clearly, in a musical performance, that's clearly not an option. You have to be able to have a range of dynamics. So this headline didn't really help very much, but you can envisage some scenarios where amplification might be an option, and that might help to limit the volume with which the person could sing. So this is just a little bit about what the UK government is saying. There was this consensus statement that you can find online. By the way, I'll be sharing these slides. Anybody who wants them can, there'll be a PDF available after this. And this just summarizes the key findings from our study, the Perform study, and also from the Sabrada study, which was done in a secret UK base called Porton Down, where they do a lot of experiments on chemicals and so on. And they've also been doing research in parallel with ours. And as I say, based on the data generated by our study, the government changed the guidelines to allow singing to open up with normal social distancing, understanding that we had demonstrated that singing didn't show colossally more aerosol production than speaking or shouting. So I'm going to pipe down now and be quiet. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I will try now to unshare my screen if I can. How do I do that? Yeah, there we go. Good. All right. Thank you very much.
Declan, thank you so much for that overview, and we'll give your voice a little bit of a break now before we pepper you with some questions from our attendees. And we're going to give other panelists a chance to chime in now, beginning with Jamie and Jonathan, to talk a bit about how the learnings from this study and other work that they have done is being applied at Christ Church, Greenwich. So over to you guys.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Declan. That was really fascinating, and I know many people will find it useful. So just briefly, at Christ Church, like many other places, I'm sure, across the country and across the world, we were in the middle of Lent, and we had all our plans in place for Easter, and we had to turn on a dime and reinvent everything. And so some of it was trial and error. But always we were guided by the fact that we were both stewards of a tradition, and I think that's really important for us, certainly in the Episcopal Church, to remember that we are as musicians, stewards of a very deep-rooted tradition, and something that's really an integral part of who we are as Episcopalians and of our worship. But while we are stewards of a tradition, we're also guardians of the safety of the people that we work with. So I think we were guided principally by those two factors, how to keep the tradition, particularly with our children's programs. Those of you that run children's choirs will know that if you miss even a few rehearsals, it's quite difficult to make up. So the prospect of missing half a year and potentially even a year or more has made us have to rethink the paradigm within which we operate. And so what have we done so far? We spent the period between Easter and the summer with using a few professionals, distanced and live streaming them. But since the summer, we have worked pretty hard at redesigning our schedules to take into account the constraints that have become apparent in no small part due to studies like Declan's. And what we've found is that we've had to operate within those constraints and build our program from there. Obviously, this relies on collaboration between team members, between musicians and clergy, and we've been very, very fortunate in having a very supportive staff and clergy who have really valued what we have set out to do. We have taken another look at the available resources that we've had, so that would mean the prayer book, potentially having evensong services, Compline services as good alternatives to communion. And we have experimented with different venues. So location is absolutely right, and we have experimented with a different venue with doors open and high ceilings and all those other good things. We have not been outside, partly because of the things that Declan was mentioning. Although over here, Declan, it's heat. Heat in September was one of the horrible things about being outside. But certainly experimenting with different venues, having singers standing far apart, maybe spreading them across the chancel area. And like many other places, it's been trial and error. When we first set out, we didn't really know how to position our singers best, and now I think we've finally hit upon an equilibrium. So don't be afraid to experiment, I would say. And then I think it's also important, and this is going to be my final point, in providing a safe environment is obviously paramount. But also we need to make sure that people feel comfortable taking part. And so providing the safe environment, but also making people feel comfortable within that environment is absolutely crucial. And so there are two primary ways in which we've done that. The first is providing the opportunity for online rehearsals. And so our rehearsals now are on Mondays and Tuesdays online, and then on Wednesdays and Thursdays in person, whereas before we would have done all our rehearsals in person. And what that does is it minimizes the amount of time that people spend in the same physical proximity to each other, but it also allows people who are not comfortable with sending their children or not comfortable attending in person to have the Zoom option, and so that they can continue being part of the program until that time that we all hope for, which is when a vaccine appears. So that's part of what we've done to make people feel comfortable. And then the final thing that we have done, and it's interesting, it was almost the last thing that we decided, and that was the question of whether or not to sing in masks. And I think what finally made us decide that we should sing in masks is the comfort factor, so that we can be seen, especially with parents, to be doing as much as is humanly possible to look after the safety of their children and the safety of all of our singers. And so we do have them singing in masks. It's not ideal, and I think certainly our choristers are troopers for putting up with it. Our rehearsals are shorter, and sometimes we have a mask break where they go outside and just can take their masks off and breathe fresh air. And it's not ideal, but it's something that we've elected to do just to make a safe environment, feel even safer, and so that people feel comfortable participating. I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Johnny.
Thanks very much, Jamie. It's been a bit of an adventure, I have to say, and we spent particularly through August and the first part of September figuring out exactly how we were going to do it. A little bit about the music program at Christ Church. We run a program with multiple choirs that has approximately 100 people involved. And that's from ages 4 to, we've got some people in their sort of late 60s, early 70s. And it includes professionals and amateurs, and it includes a broad spectrum of different people. We felt that one of the crucial things that we needed to do was to ensure that, as Declan said earlier, the participation level was we had a number of people that we'd be able to do things safely with. And so we've actually split our choirs into sort of smaller groups. So the choir of men and boys is just a small group of boys now who are singing with just 3 professional men whenever they sing. Our girls' choir is split into 2 separate groups. Our novice boys and novice girls are now meeting on their own. They would normally meet alongside the installed choristers. So we've reduced things down a lot. And the other thing that Declan mentioned is volume. And of course, it's not a good idea to ask people just to sing quietly, but the way that we've dealt with this is to generally do music that's either really quite short, or to do music that isn't very loud, so that we're not performing anything in a way that doesn't feel right. So the other things that we're doing, I mean, I watched Declan's presentation on a previous webinar, and I was very pleased that we were already doing all of the things that he suggested we should. As Jamie mentioned, when we're ventilating, when we're in the parish hall, which is a very large space we're lucky to have, we only ever have max 12 people in there, and we have all of the doors open, and it feels like we're inside. We're waiting to have squirrels run through, but we haven't as yet, although we did in church on Sunday. And because of social distancing, the congregation, the audience number is naturally lower than it would be otherwise, and we are not having any congregational singing. So because we felt that was just the best way that we could mitigate that risk, because it's very much uncontrollable otherwise. But as Jamie said, the main thing that we wanted to make sure we were doing was keeping momentum within the children's choirs programs. And so that was kind of the starting point, and the other things that we have fit around them. So the adult choir, like the others, it's only ever 12 performing at once, but they're on a rota. So everyone that's involved, everyone that wants to be involved is involved. So, and in terms of how many people have decided to sign, it's about 2/3 of our people have said we'll be there in person, and only about 1/3 have said that they don't want to come. And a lot of those people are still attending our Zoom rehearsals. I saw in the chat that there are some questions about how we're doing Zoom rehearsals. The key thing is that when people sing together, they must sing with their mics turned off. They must be muted. Otherwise, as we experienced in our first 2 or 3 weeks, it was pretty chaotic. And we will occasionally, kind of just for a bit of fun at the end of a rehearsal, say, "Oh, let's just sing something together with all our mics on, and just allow the chaos." But mostly, actual rehearsal, I think, happens immediately before services. So we meet an hour before, but probably only rehearse for 30 minutes. so that we'll have a break, the space can continue to ventilate, and hopefully we can move things, move air through. So I think if Jamie wants to add anything to that, I think that's...
No, I saw that there was a question in the chat about how we actually do our Zooms, and as Johnny just said, you know, it's a learning curve. It's been it was fairly chaotic to start with, but I would venture to say, Johnny, that we're almost experts at this stage. I do recommend having two people involved leading the rehearsal, one of whom can share a screen with the score, which is kind of what happens now, and the other one, if you have an online music subscription service, I use Spotify, you know, you can then play the Spotify, you can share both things at once, and the person with the score can scroll through the score, and we can use the pointer to show choristers different aspects of the music. So I would also say don't get bogged down in detail on Zoom. You know, just do the overall thing and move on to the next thing, because it's very easy to lose the attention of these kids, especially who have been at school, some of them online for several hours already in the day. I would say no more than 45 minutes at the most.
And what I'd add to that is, I don't think this is a time to be fussy musicians. You know, I think pragmatism in how we're going to perform is quite an important part. I mean, you know, I'm planning rehearsals really quite carefully when we're in person, so that they can be as efficient as possible. I mean, I generally pride myself on my efficiency, but I think it's a need to really work out right now, just to keep the time down.
Thanks to you both so much for that. And maybe just before pulling Andrew and Meg into this conversation, we do have quite a number of questions about masks, whether or not to wear masks while singing, and how far apart singers should stand. And I wonder, Declan, if you could weigh in on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that our study did not look specifically at masks and singing. In my clinical practice, I'm wearing masks all day, every day, and I've learned to loathe them, as I think probably everybody has. I've tried in spare moments to do some singing in a mask, and I know there are different designs. I have found it very difficult. It's not so much the actual singing that's the issue, it's at the end of the phrase where you take a deep breath in and the thing sucks back in on your mouth and nose. I'm sure there are clever ways of doing it. I know that there are studies that demonstrate that singing with masks does significantly attenuate the amount of particulate matter that's being produced. So I think intuitively it seems like a good idea. The other mitigations that I've talked about obviously need to be put in place. What was the other question, Michael? I'm sorry, I've forgotten.
The distance between singers and between the ensemble and those listening, or the congregation. Yeah, well, I mean, not our study, but the other UK study, the Sobrada study, demonstrated that there isn't any significant additional distance of particulate matter travelled when singing versus speaking. So on that basis, the UK government said that 2 meters between singers is what they have considered to be acceptable. Now, the other thing, of course, that's worth bearing in mind is that if you're back to back with another singer, then clearly you're facing in opposite directions. So that's not really an issue in terms of distancing. And equally, if you're side by side, then that's less of an issue. If you're facing each other, then the 2 meters really does become very important. But one way of doing this, and I know that a lot of choirs have done this already, is to sing in a circle. You have to have a reasonably big circle if you're a choir of any number of people. But that would certainly be one way of doing it. And I know that it's actually quite a visually appealing way of doing it as well. I know that a lot of professional choirs have done recordings like that. Thank you so much for those responses. And I know we have kind of a string of other practical considerations to do with face shields and balconies and all sorts of things, which we'll get back to. But I want to draw Andrew into the conversation on kind of broader implications for the liturgy, thinking about choirs in this time and trying to mitigate risk. So we're looking forward to your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Michael. I should say that, there are a couple of liturgical and pastoral issues which I think are intimately related to each other and which COVID has brought up for all of us. And, while these may at first blush seem to be things that particularly concern the clergy, really they impact everybody who makes any decision about the church's life, whether ordained or lay. Much like, I should say, about Christ Church in Georgetown, much like in Greenwich, music is at that very center of the liturgical life of this parish, and has been for a very long time. And so having, the necessary limits on choral singing that have come with COVID has, impacted the life of Christ Church Georgetown as well. But I think that there are really, sort of broadly speaking, two realities which impact how we think about the liturgical life of the parish as we go through this time. The first one of those is that COVID has really changed the constituencies of the parish. We're used to thinking about members of an Episcopal church as belonging to, the early service crowd or the family service crowd or the main service crowd. And now what we really have is a group of people who will come in person, but they'll only come to an outdoor service, or people who will come in person, but only to a very small indoor service and, without singing or something. And then you have people who will come in person no matter what. And then you have sizable groups of people who won't come at all out of health concerns. And it's important to remember also that members of our choirs may appear in any of these groups. And this, I think, in some ways references something Jamie mentioned before about making sure that people feel comfortable coming to church. I mean, the fundamental parochial ministry is the cure of souls, and that's something that's not possible to do when the only thing that the church provides people don't, or significant proportions of the people don't feel comfortable coming to. So, in our experience here in Georgetown, since the Bishop of Washington has permitted regathering, we have this pattern where we have a very small outdoor service in the garden where there's just an oboist at some distance from the congregation, which is limited to 30 people. And then we have an indoor service with just a soloist. And then we have a recorded service that's put up on YouTube with the full choir. And then there are some smaller gatherings via Zoom. So it seems to me that the liturgical implications have as much to do with how we arrange singers and congregations, which has a lot to do with the particular dimensions of church buildings and the size of choirs and congregations, as we've discussed, as with the ways in which we think about how to sustain people's devotional life in a time when it's not possible to gather in the way we have been accustomed to. At the same time, I think it's probably important to remember that this will not go on forever. I mean, we live in that Christian hope that COVID will not endure. And even though there are many of us, myself included, who thought we'd be over all of this by Christmas, and that hasn't turned out to be the case, I don't think that our lifetimes will be, at least not my lifetime, I hope, will have COVID as a sort of permanent feature limiting our gatherings in this way. So we have exhausted our sort of liturgical stopgaps, and now we are kind of living with COVID as a medium-term issue, but one which has long-term implications on the life of the church. So we have to take into account those new constituencies, which I mentioned, who have different levels of comfort with in-person worship, singing or no singing, frankly. But at the same time, we don't want to have huge areas of our church's witness perhaps irreparably mothballed because we're not able to sort of put a full choir in the chancel in this time. So, one of the things that we're doing here is that we've continued to support our choir, which is fully professional, and they record for our virtual service every week. And then they rotate through, I should say, our organist rotates through the soloists that he has, at our in-person services. Because we're very keen that when it becomes, at least in Washington, both permissible and safe to have more music in the service, that we haven't, completely gutted this, frankly, excellent ensemble that we have assembled in this place. So I think bearing those two things in mind, one, that, for the time that we're in COVID, that the constituencies of the church have changed and the pastoral needs of the church have changed, and that that the liturgy is one of the tools the church has, and as Episcopalians, the fundamental tool we have to meet people's pastoral needs. That's going to be different now. But that's also not something that we can allow, I think, as stewards of this, frankly, very vital tradition, to impact our ability to continue to have these very, very strong music programs, especially as we hope that COVID, won't go on, forever. So that's the challenge of the moment, to keep both of those things in mind at the same time.
Andrew, thanks so much. And thanks for connecting both kind of those challenges to opportunities for musicians, other liturgical leaders to see and hear their congregation with new eyes, that sometimes we pigeonhole people into this or that service. And this is an opportunity to think about the congregation in a different way and how we program liturgy in response to the community's needs right now. So thank you so much. And that's a perfect kind of pivot to bringing Meg in. And we'd love to hear from you, Meg, a little bit more about creative planning to develop choral programming that we might not otherwise have thought to do if it were not for this, this great challenge.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael. I want to pick up on an underlying theme that's been mentioned by both Andrew and Jamie, which is that we serve in most of our churches a really wide variety of people within our choirs. At St. Michael's in Dallas, right before COVID hit, we had about 100 people engaged in various choirs from our youngest to our oldest, and just an incredible diversity of walks of life, and at this point, an incredible diversity of comfort levels with COVID. And some people who are immunocompromised and really restricted in what they're able to do. And what we have tried to do is make it possible for everyone to feel engaged in some way. And so to provide sort of different tiers of offerings. One of the interesting evaluations we made early on had to do with our adult choir, which is a combination of professionals and volunteer singers. Some of our volunteer singers were not super comfortable with recording virtual anthems, and so we needed to think of a way to engage them and to keep them involved in the ministry that has meant so much to them and is, like their second family. And so what we did was to evaluate what choir did for them in normal times and see if we could recreate that through a different apparatus. And so for these choir members who are volunteers, who, have a significant skill level, but maybe aren't confident on their own, what we thought is, first of all, they present something as a gift to the congregation, right? To be a member of a choir is to give. And second of all, they have an incredible passion for music. They love what they do. Otherwise, they wouldn't dedicate the countless hours we require of them. And so what we did was, for that particular subset, we created a weekly music podcast where any of them who are interested can talk about an anthem or a hymn that has been particularly meaningful to their spiritual life. And this accomplishes many things. First of all, it gives them a voice at a time when they wouldn't have had a voice. Second of all, it reminds the congregation at large how invested these volunteers are in the music ministry and how rich the meaning of music is for them. So it does a number of things. And if we hadn't gone back to the basics and reevaluated what actually different groups are getting out of choir, we would never have come up with that idea. And it's been tremendously successful for us. Like Jamie, we have a significant chorister program, and our primary concern with the choristers was how to keep energy going in the program, because, virtual learning it's difficult to convey energy. And so we knew in the summer we wouldn't be able to do an in-person chorister camp. We would have to do a virtual one. And so as we were doing that, our primary goals were, first of all, to find ways to keep these kids engaged and energized. And second of all, to find ways, even though it was virtual, to make it tangible somehow. And so we, for instance, did a composition project related to the musical theme of the weekend, where they actually had to have a pencil and a paper and do something physical, so that even for a significant amount of the time that they were engaged, they were looking at a screen. they had portions where they were doing something physical, where their bodies were engaged in a different way. And so I think, my main point is this is a real time for creativity. And of course, we all are up to our ears in trying to figure out how to do liturgies, and that's the core of what we do. But we also need to find creative ways to engage the members of our communities who can feel peripheral in times like this. And it's really important when we're doing that to go back to the fundamentals and think about why these people do what they do, and try and provide that maybe in a different way than usually we would.
Thank you so much for that, Meg. That's really helpful. And we have a whole bunch of questions from attendees. I would just remind those who are here that if you came late, if you missed anything, this webinar is going to be available after the fact on the SEEP website. And Declan has also very generously offered to make his slides available. So some specific kind of PPE and space related questions. Declan, would you say anything? You mentioned masks, about the issue of face shields or barriers or other kind of protective equipment that individual singers or choirs singing together may or may not use?
Sure. I mean, I would preface this by saying that I am not an aerosol scientist. I have been working with aerosol scientists over the last few months on this, and I'm a singer myself, so I have a kind of rudimentary understanding of this. But I mean, I think the key thing is really just to think about this distinction between aerosols and droplets. Aerosols, as I said, will float around in the environment, and a face shield or a perspex screen or whatever else is not going to make much difference to that. Whereas they will capture the droplets. And so it seems to me that if you've got your spacing right, if you're sort of 2 meters away from people, 2 meters away from people, then the face shield thing seems to be much less useful and relevant. I haven't sung in a face shield. I think if you were in a situation where you were going to find it difficult to avoid being close in with other singers, then a face shield could be useful. And I know that some performing arts teaching institutions are starting to employ perspex screens between students and teachers. But again, it's just thinking about aerosol versus droplets.
Declan, could you say a little bit about, your study was individual singers, because that was the way you dealt with it in the lab. But we have a few questions about how does that relate to larger numbers of people singing together in the same space at the same time, which you touched upon, talking about obviously the size of the ensemble, the number of people, and how much space there is significant. I think this is partly coming from the fact that Anthony Fauci, a very significant voice on COVID-19 here in the United States, said to the entire House of Bishops that there's nothing more dangerous that you can do than to sing in church right now. And so that has been in the mind, I think, of many bishops and therefore then rectors and music directors.
Yeah, no, and I know it. And we've had similarly, I don't know how best to phrase it, unhelpful comments made by politicians and other people in this country as well. And I think it all goes back to the fact that at the beginning of the pandemic, there were these outbreaks that were centered around choirs. We weren't really sure why those were happening. And changing that narrative, changing the story that had developed that singing is dangerous, and the minute somebody opens their mouth to sing at a football game or in a restaurant, then they've got to be shut down. So yeah, I mean, the study has, I hope, helped to debunk the myth that singing is inherently dangerous. Now, as to the number of people singing in any particular space, clearly it adds up. If you have 5 people versus 500 people, depending on what space you're in, that's going to make a very large difference. And in this country, every institution, every choir, every group is having to do its own risk assessments. And if you need or have to have more people in a particular group, then the counterbalance for that is that you do it in a bigger space, or you do it with more ventilation, or you do it with a shorter duration of singing, and so on. So yes, the corporate thing of singing and lots of people singing in the same space is definitely a consideration.
Could you say a few more words about ventilation? And you did address this at the top, but obviously great diversity of buildings in the church, lots of them with various levels of HVAC, no HVAC. Churches considering the use of UV light, specific filters for heating and cooling. I know you didn't study that in the Perform study, but you've been talking about this a lot. What have you gleaned or see worth sharing?
Yeah, well, I mean, on a practical level, we are not all going to have access to very high quality filters that we can install in our churches, our rehearsal rooms, our clinic rooms for that matter. I mean, the hospitals don't all have access to these things. So we just need to think about some sort of pragmatic measures, and opening your windows and doors and allowing air to vent through is one really relatively straightforward way of doing things. But at the moment, there are no particularly good ways of quantifying what are the right and safe parameters for doing that. As time goes on and as the research develops, particularly with computational fluid dynamic modeling, we should get better ideas about the parameters in terms of the number of people in a particular space, perhaps the size of that space, the orientation of doors and windows and so on, and that might involve measuring flow of air at any given time. But I don't think we know a huge amount about the science of it at the moment.
Thanks. Another couple of questions about congregational singing, and this came up a bit from Jamie and Jonathan as well, who it sounds like had decided to not do congregational singing at this time. Given the content of your study as well as other studies, have we learned anything about whether there's any greater risk to congregations singing if they're going to be saying prayers out loud? Could there be instructions given about singing quietly? Are there any best practices that are developing around the possibilities for congregational singing?
Is that to me?
And I think that really could be to anyone, but maybe Declan, you go first.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing about numbers, isn't it? If you've got a congregation of 20, you're probably on reasonably safe ground in a big building. If you've got a congregation of 200 in a smaller building, then not so much. I don't, and I think that trying to limit people to singing quietly, it seems to me, is going to be a very difficult thing to do. You know, and actually, the study demonstrated that it was only really at the very quietest singing, so we're talking kind of pianissimo singing, that the amount of aerosol produced was roughly equivalent to when you were breathing. Now, you can't, in all honesty, persuade a congregation just to sing piano or pianissimo throughout, so I think you have to think about other mitigations.
Just a practical note to add to that, Declan. The way we get around it is we print the words so we don't sing all the verses of a hymn. And when I say we, I mean the choir. We'll sing 2 or 3 verses of a hymn, and we print the words in the order of service. But there's a rubric asking that the congregation who are there in person do not sing, but the congregation who are sitting in the comfort of their own living room, they should feel free to join in.
That's nice. I like that.
Thank you for that. There are some questions related to the safety of shorter rehearsals, shorter repertoire as well, and using Zoom rehearsals and in-person rehearsals, and a request to say a little bit more about best practices for the Zoom rehearsals that people are struggling with, the lag related to Zoom, etc. And so I guess this is primarily to Jamie, Jonathan, and Meg, what you've discovered with these Zoom rehearsals and ways to make them more effective, more useful, and more enjoyable.
Well, I can say that at St. Michael with our choristers, when we have virtual musical experiences, they come in 2 varieties. The first is we do individual coachings with all of our choristers virtually. And those have been very, very, very effective in skill building. So we have actually seen our choristers' musical skills shoot through the roof at a much faster rate than we normally would. The individual attention is fantastic. What we do when we're together together and we're trying to have some semblance of a musical experience together is we do an evening prayer service with chant. So we assign each of our choristers particular parts of it. They practice ahead of time with us, and everybody has a role. When we're going back and forth one at a time like that, it's a much better musical experience. The one time where we let all cacophony break loose is on the Lord's Prayer. We let them all unmute at the same time. It's like, I don't know, something from Acts. Those are the solutions that we've found. Rehearsals together are very difficult.
We're coming to the end of our time, but we do have a question that's just come up late that I think is worth posing to you. What about congregational humming is the question. Is there a way for the congregation to participate in any way while the choir is leading a hymn, making noise? I know this would then include breathing out through the nose. So maybe that relates, Declan, to your study.
Yeah, I mean, instinctively, I think that sounds like a reasonably sensible idea. The air, with the caveat that we didn't specifically study humming, but the amount of air or the amount of airflow when humming is going to be substantially less than when singing. It's going to be a bit more than breathing, I would suggest, and hence the amount of aerosol produced is going to be a bit more than breathing. But clearly, the droplet thing is not going to be an issue at that stage, and sounds quite reasonable. Yeah, humming to hymns. Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
And it does sound a bit miserable.
It does. Yeah.
And a question to Jamie: How far apart are your choristers in person at the moment, singing with masks on?
They are at least 6 feet apart, more like 9.
Yeah.
Great, and it sounded like what was shared kind of broadly is the further apart, the better, while being able to continue to sing as an ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks for that. So thank you all for being on this panel. Thanks for those who have joined. You've given us much to think about, not only about practical risk mitigation factors, but also the culture of choirs, the importance of community among choirs and in the congregation, and thinking about the spiritual care not only of choirs and but of whole congregations as we move through this. So thank you for what you offered. Thank you for the questions that came, and we look forward to seeing you at a future SEEP webinar. Take care, everyone.